Hello and welcome to our digital lecture. Today I'll be covering Chapter 14 as we discuss how the United States moves towards civil war. The chapter opens up with a map of the United States in 1861. And if you look closely, there's a few details I want to point out. If you notice this line here, that's identifying the boundary between the Union and Confederacy. And the green territory are the states that seceded or left the Union. There's a few key vocabulary words that you are going to want to be familiar with. Fugitive Slave Act, Secede, Compromise of 1850, Kansas-Nebraska Act, and Civil War. If you're not sure what a civil war is, it's a war between citizens of the same country. Think Avengers, when the team split up and was fighting against itself. Lesson 1 focuses on the attempted compromise that would inevitably end in war. As the United States gains more territories in the 1800s, the debate over slavery arises multiple times. If you look at the map to the left, you can see this red line going right across the country. That's the 3630 latitude line, which we'll talk about a little bit more later. A few things that helped fuel the debate against and for slavery was the annexation of Texas, the acquisition of the remaining Mexican territories in 1848. Furthermore, conflict over the spread of slavery would lead to a new political party. The Free Soil Party was a minor political party in the United States that developed before the Civil War. The party was opposed to the extension of slavery into newly acquired territories. The party ideas were popular with small farmers, merchants, and mill workers. In your inquiry journal, you had a question that said, what was the motto of the Free Soil Party, and why do you suppose they chose that name? Free soil, free speech, free labor, free men was their motto. They opposed slavery and wanted all American soil to be free from slavery. In 1849, when California applied to become a state without slavery, it upset the balance, and Southerners talked about seceding or leaving. The Compromise of 1850 was an attempt to stop the South from leaving the Union. It did the following things: permitted slavery in Washington, D.C., but at the same time outlawed the slave trade there. Added California as a free state. It gave Utah and New Mexico territories popular sovereignty to decide if they would become free or slave states. It redefined the boundaries of Texas following the Mexican-American War. And lastly, established the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. The Fugitive Slave Act made it a criminal offense to assist enslaved people escaping north. Some Northerners refused to obey the law, and some judges in the North would not enforce the law anyways. David Thoreau wrote that if the law requires you to be the agent of injustice to another, then I say break it. He wrote this as many free African Americans and whites formed an interconnected system called the Underground Railroad, which helped runaways find their way to freedom. Another inquiry journal question is, what is strange about the drawing captioned Peace Convention? What do you think the artist's point of view portrayed in this drawing? If you're anything like me, you were probably a little bit confused as to where to find the image. This image was pictured at the opening of Lesson 1, so let's take a look at it now if this is your first time looking at the image. What do you see? You see two different groups facing off against each other, some pointing weapons at each other, others holding up their fists in a menacing manner. So if the title of this is Peace Convention at Fort Scott, Kansas, does it look very peaceful? I think we can all agree it does not. If this is supposed to be a meeting for peace, but everyone looks angry and they're pointing weapons at it, so that's definitely making the image look odd. The artist seems to think that peace is not going to be reached with the two opposing sides coming together and threatening the other side. The next attempt at compromise is the Kansas-Nebraska Act. The Kansas-Nebraska Act gave the voters in Kansas and Nebraska the right to decide for themselves if they would or would not permit slavery in their territories. What happened in Kansas is that both anti-slavery and pro-slavery people met up there and faced off against each other in what would be later called Bleeding Kansas. I'm not going to play this video now, but I recommend that you come back to the presentation and view it. It talks about how you can almost pinpoint the Civil War to this one piece of legislation as being so pivotal. Another thing that we need to discuss about the Kansas-Nebraska Act is that it, in effect, repeals the Compromise of 1820. Remember when we talked about the 3630 line that went across the country? Well, that line said that slavery would only be permitted south of that line. In effect, the Kansas-Nebraska Act repeals the Compromise of 1820. Your inquiry journal question is, what is meant by the expression Bleeding Kansas? It meant that people flocked to Kansas, which was the center of the slavery debate, and on both sides there was bloodshed. If we look at a map from 1850 and 1854, you can see how the territory changes over time. Let's focus on the unorganized territories over here on both sides. So if you notice, this orange is territory close to slaveholding. That is therefore reduced after the Kansas-Nebraska Act, where now you have some of those territories being open to slaveholding. And again, it also gets rid of that 3630 latitude line that had been agreed upon in the Compromise of 1820. Let's quickly take a look at a primary source by Stephen Douglas. So Stephen Douglas was the one who introduced the Kansas-Nebraska Act to the Senate and reopened that debate about slavery. Read starting here in the second paragraph where he says, and just so you know, the language that he's using would in our time be considered offensive, but when he said it, it was acceptable at that time. In the debate between him and Abraham Lincoln, Senator Douglas says, "But the Abolition Party really think that under the Declaration of Independence, the Negro is equal to the white man, and that Negro equality is an inalienable right conferred by the Almighty, and hence that all human laws or a violation of it are null and void. With such men it is no use for me to argue. I hold that the signers of the Declaration of Independence had no reference to Negroes at all when they declared all men to be treated equal. They were speaking of white men." Douglas is arguing that because the writers of the Declaration of Independence would not have considered African Americans as equals, therefore slavery is permissible and it should be left to the people to decide. Thank you for tuning in. 2 things that I need you to complete now. Make sure that you answer the guiding questions in Google Classroom. Make sure that you watch the Kansas-Nebraska Act video as well, as it points out how that specific legislation would eventually lead to civil war. Thank you for tuning in.